Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to discuss the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. And we have with us Jay Smith, New Testament professor here at Dallas Theological Seminary, to help guide our discussion as we think about the possibility of teaching and preaching through the book of Romans. Jay, welcome.
Thank you, Herb.
When we think about Romans, and it really is one of the more important writings of Paul. If you were to tell me the big idea, the thesis, the governing thoughts of Paul in that book of Romans to the Romans, what would you tell me?
I think I would say something like the theme, the big idea, is the gospel of God and how the Romans fit into God's unfolding plan and his revelation of the gospel. Anticipated in the Old Testament, brought in many ways to fruition in the death and resurrection of the Lord, and yet we're still anticipating a future fulfillment via his return. And where do the Romans fit into that?
Okay. What is it? What's happening in Rome? What is it that has driven Paul to write this letter at this particular time?
I think there are roughly two things. One relates to himself and his missionary journeys. He's just now wrapping up his final missionary journey, or his third, I should probably say third journey, and is headed to Jerusalem. And after his stop in Jerusalem, he wants to go on to Spain, and he wants to use Rome and the Romans as kind of a launching pad. So he's writing kind of to introduce himself to the Romans and to pave his way for his missionary journeys. But the Romans themselves seem to be having some difficulty, some divisions, probably along Jew-Gentile lines. And I think he's writing to help heal those rifts. And so that there's a Paul concern, his missionary journey is wrapping up and wanting to start a new venture, and the division in the church. But Paul's journey now to Jerusalem prior to his next venture and his stopover, hopefully at Rome, is to bring a gift to the church in Jerusalem to help solidify Jew-Gentile unity. And I think that plays into exactly why he writes to the Romans in Rome. So there's a number of moving parts, but they revolve around his ministry, the Roman situation, and how those two kind of intersect.
Okay. So when you think about Romans, focusing on how he is concerned with affirming the church as fitting into God's big picture, God's redemptive program,
Right.
and recognizing there's an already not yet aspect to that redemptive program, and his concern about these Jew and Gentile relations. What are some of the theological thrusts that seem to rise to the top when you think about Romans? What would you say are maybe two major theological themes?
Well, there's a lot of themes, but two things jumped into my mind with your question. One is there's an individual dimension, one's own personal relationship to the Lord in a salvific way. And then there's also a people group relationship. The gospel was promised to Israel, to the Jewish people, and yet by and large they have abandoned it, they've rejected it. And in this way, in some ways, it becomes a problem for Paul. The gospel was for Israel, and Israel's rejected it. So it's not only a personal question he's dealing with, my relationship to the Lord, but he's also dealing with on an ethnic or national. How is it that the people who the gospel is intended for primarily, or first of all, the Jews, have rejected it, and the Gentiles, who were the outsiders, are now in? He's got to deal with this issue, and I think that's what the two major, or at least two things he's got to deal with: personal salvation and this ethnic corporate salvation, if you will.
Okay, all right. Let's think about preaching through the book of Romans. Barnhouse,
Mm-hmm.
pastor of 10th Press,
Right.
many, many years ago, spent years preaching through the book of Romans. That type of devotion to preaching a specific letter or book from the New Testament or Old Testament probably won't work in today's 21st century hearers. How might you approach, what would you say to a pastor who is contemplating preaching through the book of Romans? What suggestions might you make? How might you approach it?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I probably wouldn't advise trying to go march through 16 chapters nonstop. I would probably take it in segments and sections. I could foresee maybe doing chapters 1 to 3 and then pausing and then coming back and doing maybe, depends where you want to break it, maybe 4 to 8 or 4 and 5 and then pausing, mixing things up a little bit. But the thing I think I would probably recommend is that the teacher, the preacher, the pastor try to explain Romans and what Paul's trying to achieve the best he can, the best he understands it. And by that I mean I wouldn't strain to be incredibly practical, because I kind of believe all learning, all understanding is transferable. And I think I would advise the pastor, the teacher, to not think in terms of behavior modification, but in terms of renewal of the mind and personal transformation. And when things don't seem incredibly practical for the very moment, those are the very things I think God uses to kind of rewire our thinking.
Okay.
So I would encourage the pastor to be faithful to the best they can to what Paul's after, realizing that that's the stuff that God uses to renew our minds and transform our thinking in our lives.
Okay. What helpful resources might you recommend if I'm planning a series and I want to gather some books that would help me understand the book of Hebrews, to present it in a way that would do just that, transform the way in which we think and the way in which we live for
Right.
God?
Well, I don't know much about Hebrews because you asked me about Hebrews. But,
Did I?
Yeah, but the book of Romans, well, I know a little bit about Hebrews. But in terms of Romans, I think Pride of Place probably goes to Doug Moo's commentary
Okay.
and Tom Schreiner's commentary. Now, as soon as I say that, there are many others, and many other very fine ones. And the second hesitancy, I would say, sometimes those are a little daunting and maybe a little too complicated for certain pastors or teachers. And that's where Moo is particularly helpful, because he's written a number of commentaries at different levels. So he's got his very heavy scholarly work, and if that's too much, there are some other ones at a different level that are much more accessible. So I would encourage the pastor teacher look at those if the larger work's too difficult, too complicated.
So has he contributed to the encountering the book of Romans? Is that
he has. That's a helpful volume, encountering the book of Romans. It's in its second edition now, and it's really quite well done, and it's accessible, and I think it would help a lot of pastors be able to maybe focus a little more clearly. A lot of times big commentaries cover everything, and it's a little daunting for any pastor to say, what do I choose out of that? Well, Moo's done a nice job in selection. But again, there are a lot of fine commentaries. Those two probably, like I said, have pride of place in the evangelical world, but there are many good ones.
Okay. Jay, thank you so much. And thank
you.
you for joining us. And for those of you who are interested in doing further study in Romans, not Hebrews, or preaching through the book of Romans, feel free to touch base with Moo's commentary on the book of Romans and Thomas Schreiner's work on Romans. Until the next time, thank you so much, and we'll talk with you later.